After Jeffrey Manchester became a name that appeared across American news broadcasts under the nickname Roofman, investigators began looking deeper into his past to answer a much larger question. How did a former U.S. Army paratrooper become one of the strangest robbers in modern American crime history? Jeffrey was born in 1971 in Sacramento, California. According to investigative records released years later, he lived a relatively normal life before joining the military. After reaching adulthood, Jeffrey served in the 82nd Airborne Division, one of the most well-known airborne units in the United States Army. It was an extremely demanding environment. Soldiers were trained to climb, move tactically, navigate obstacles, and operate under intense pressure. Years later, investigators realized those same military skills appeared clearly in the way Jeffrey carried out burglaries and avoided capture. After leaving the Army, Jeffrey returned to civilian life, but adapting to a normal routine proved difficult. His work became unstable, financial pressure started building, and his personal life gradually began falling apart. According to multiple investigative reports and later accounts, Jeffrey ran into serious financial trouble during the late 1990s. That period also marked the beginning of his first criminal activity. At the time, almost nobody would have imagined that a former American paratrooper would eventually become the target of multi-state investigations across the country. But not long afterward, Jeffrey Manchester began developing the method that would eventually earn him a notorious nickname in the American media. After Jeffrey Manchester became a name featured across American news broadcasts under the nickname Roofman, investigators began looking deeper into his past to answer a much larger question. How did a former U.S. Army paratrooper become one of the strangest robbers in modern American crime history? Jeffrey was born in 1971 in Sacramento, California. According to investigative records released years later, he lived a relatively normal life before joining the military. After reaching adulthood, Jeffrey served in the 82nd Airborne Division, one of the most respected airborne units in the United States Army. It was an extremely demanding environment. Soldiers were trained to climb, move tactically, navigate obstacles, and operate under intense pressure. Years later, investigators realized those same military skills appeared clearly in the way Jeffrey carried out break-ins and avoided capture. After leaving the Army, Jeffrey returned to civilian life, but adapting to a normal routine proved difficult. He struggled to hold steady jobs, financial pressure started building, and his personal life gradually began falling apart. According to multiple investigative reports and later accounts, Jeffrey ran into serious financial trouble during the late 1990s. That period also marked the beginning of his first criminal activity. At the time, almost nobody would have imagined that a former American paratrooper would eventually become the target of multi-state investigations across the country. But not long afterward, Jeffrey Manchester began developing the method that would eventually earn him a notorious nickname in the American media. By the late 1990s, Jeffrey Manchester had begun developing a method of robbery that looked completely different from most armed robberies happening in America at the time. He wasn't targeting major banks in broad daylight. He wasn't organizing high-speed getaway crews. And he wasn't building a large criminal network. Instead, Jeffrey became obsessed with studying fast food restaurants, especially McDonald's locations. According to investigative records released years later, he spent long periods of time watching closing schedules, early morning employee routines, camera placement, staff entrances, and the roof structure of individual restaurants. Investigators later believed Jeffrey had identified a major weakness in how many restaurants operated during that era. Most security systems were focused on doors and windows. Almost nobody expected a robber to come through the roof. That was the moment Jeffrey began building the method that would eventually make him infamous years later. He climbed onto restaurant rooftops late at night, drilled holes through the ceiling, then quietly lowered himself inside and hid in darkness for hours until the following morning. When the first employees arrived to open the restaurant, Jeffrey would suddenly appear holding a gun and demand access to the safe. What many victims remembered most years later was his behavior during the robberies. According to several employees, Jeffrey almost always spoke calmly. He rarely yelled or lost control the way many armed robbers typically did. In some cases, Jeffrey even apologized to employees before locking them inside freezer rooms to delay calls to police. But investigators later said that calmness made him even more dangerous. Because in their view, Jeffrey wasn't acting impulsively. Everything was planned in advance with an extremely high level of calculation. And while police departments across multiple states were still trying to figure out who was behind these bizarre break-ins, Jeffrey Manchester continued carrying out more robberies using the exact same method. Around that time, a new name also began appearing inside American investigative files and media reports: Roofman. From 1998 through the early 2000s, the number of robberies sharing the same unusual method began increasing across multiple states in the southeastern United States. Most of the targets were McDonald's restaurants or other fast food businesses that operated late into the night or around the clock. At first, local police departments treated the incidents as unrelated robberies. But as investigators dug deeper, they began noticing a series of highly unusual similarities. The suspect almost always appeared only after secretly entering the building hours earlier. The rooftops frequently showed signs of being drilled through. Alarm systems rarely detected the initial break-in. And in case after case, employees described a suspect who remained remarkably calm during the robbery. According to investigative records released years later, Jeffrey often spent hours hidden inside a restaurant before the first employees arrived for the morning shift. He understood how the work schedules operated, knew when managers typically arrived, and had a surprisingly accurate sense of when the safe would be opened. That led many investigators to believe Jeffrey wasn't simply studying his targets from the outside. He was carefully learning how each restaurant functioned from the inside as well. During this period, the nickname Roofman began appearing in American news reports. The name spread quickly because the method was unlike anything most people had seen before. A robber climbing onto a rooftop in the middle of the night, drilling through the ceiling, and then waiting silently in darkness for hours before suddenly appearing the next morning was almost unheard of on such a large scale. According to numerous investigative documents, Jeffrey was suspected of being connected to dozens of robberies across multiple states. The total amount of money taken was relatively modest compared to some of America's most famous bank robberies of the same era. But what made the case so remarkable was Jeffrey's ability to disappear after each crime. For years, law enforcement agencies could rarely predict where he would strike next. And while investigators were still trying to connect the growing number of robberies to a single suspect, Jeffrey Manchester began making the first mistakes that would eventually change everything. After years of searching for the suspect behind a series of unusual McDonald's robberies, law enforcement finally began closing in on Jeffrey Manchester in 2000. According to investigative records released later, the turning point came after several robberies occurred in North Carolina. Detectives noticed that the crimes followed an almost identical pattern: entering through the roof, a hiding inside the building overnight, a confronting employees in the morning, and disappearing before police could arrive. As the number of incidents continued to grow, investigators began sharing information across multiple jurisdictions. That was the moment when Roofman stopped being just a nickname used by the media and became a genuine target of a large-scale law enforcement investigation. According to court records, Jeffrey was eventually arrested in North Carolina after investigators connected him to a number of previous robberies. The arrest quickly attracted national media attention because, for years, Roofman had managed to vanish after nearly every robbery while leaving behind very few useful clues. However, the most serious aspect of the case was not simply the money that had been stolen. In several robberies, Jeffrey locked employees inside walk-in freezers after taking cash from the restaurant, delaying their ability to contact law enforcement. Prosecutors argue that this conduct met the legal definition of kidnapping under U.S. criminal law, even if Jeffrey's primary objective was to buy time for his escape. That detail ultimately played a major role in increasing the severity of his sentence. During trial, Jeffrey Manchester received a total sentence of 45 years in prison on multiple charges, including armed robbery, kidnapping, burglary, and numerous related criminal offenses. At the time, many people believed the story of Roofman had finally come to an end. But 4 years later, Jeffrey Manchester would shock the entire United States once again. In 2004, while serving a 45-year prison sentence at Brown Creek Correctional Institution, Jeffrey Manchester stunned law enforcement once again with a daring prison escape. According to investigative records released years later, Jeffrey spent considerable time carefully studying how goods were transported and how vehicles moved throughout the prison grounds. Investigators believe he repeatedly observed security procedures and daily operations before deciding to make his move. On the day of the escape, Jeffrey managed to gain access to a truck leaving the prison complex and hid underneath the vehicle in order to get out. By the time prison staff realized he was missing, he was already far beyond the facility's control perimeter. News that a prisoner serving a 45-year sentence for a series of armed robberies had escaped quickly spread across television broadcasts and newspapers throughout the United States. Law enforcement agencies in multiple states were warned that Jeffrey might attempt to commit new crimes or disappear under a new identity. But what concerned investigators most was Jeffrey Manchester himself. He was a former U.S. Army paratrooper with extensive military training. He had years of experience breaking into secure locations. He knew how to move quietly and avoid detection for long periods of time. And perhaps most importantly, he had already spent years staying ahead of law enforcement during his robbery spree. According to numerous investigative accounts, after escaping from prison, Jeffrey virtually disappeared from the system for a significant period of time. No one knew exactly where he was. No one knew what identity he might be using. And while law enforcement agencies across the United States continued searching for the man known as Roofman, Jeffrey Manchester was about to enter the strangest chapter of his entire story. Instead of fleeing the country or hiding in a remote location, he chose a place that almost no one would have expected: a Toys R Us store in the heart of Charlotte, North Carolina. After escaping from North Carolina in 2004, Jeffrey Manchester disappeared from the sight of American law enforcement for months. At first, investigators believed he had either left the state or adopted a new identity to continue his life on the run somewhere else. But as time passed, the case became increasingly puzzling. There were virtually no clear financial records, rental agreements, travel records, or other traces connected to Jeffrey appearing anywhere in the system. According to investigative records released years later, Jeffrey eventually made his way to Charlotte, North Carolina. There, he chose a hiding place that almost nobody could have imagined: a Toys R Us store located in the middle of one of the city's busiest commercial districts. Instead of renting an apartment or living in a motel, Jeffrey secretly built a hidden living space behind a wall inside the store. The area was located near a stairwell and carefully concealed from employees and customers. Inside, he kept blankets and bedding, extra clothing, food, batteries, personal supplies, and even a baby monitor system that allowed him to listen to activity outside his hidden space. During the day, Jeffrey remained almost completely hidden behind walls or inside restricted maintenance areas of the building. At night, after the store had closed, he began moving throughout the massive toy store. According to investigators who later reconstructed the events, Jeffrey took food directly from the store, used restrooms inside the shopping center, and on some occasions even rode bicycles through the toy aisles in the middle of the night. What made the story so remarkable was that all of this continued for months without anyone realizing he was living inside the building. Some employees only began to suspect something was wrong after repeatedly noticing merchandise being moved from its original location or food mysteriously disappearing overnight. At the time, many assumed someone was secretly breaking into the store after closing. The truth was far stranger. Jeffrey wasn't sneaking into the store every night. He was actually living there. For months, Roofman existed almost like a ghost in the middle of Charlotte, moving through one of the city's busiest commercial areas while remaining completely invisible to nearly everyone around him. And while law enforcement agencies across the United States continued searching for an escaped prisoner, Jeffrey Manchester was quietly building an entirely new life for himself under a completely different identity. During the time Jeffrey Manchester was secretly living inside the Toys R Us store in Charlotte, he wasn't just hiding from law enforcement. According to investigative records released years later, he had begun building an entirely new identity for himself. Jeffrey adopted the alias John Zorn and gradually blended into everyday American life. During the day, he appeared to be an ordinary man. He moved freely around the city, attended church services, and formed new relationships with people who had no reason to suspect who he really was. It was during this period that Jeffrey met a woman named Lee Wainscott. According to accounts later made public, Lee had no idea that the man she was seeing was actually an escaped prisoner being hunted by law enforcement agencies across the United States. What particularly caught investigators' attention was Jeffrey's ability to maintain two almost completely separate lives at the same time. By day, he lived as an ordinary citizen under his new identity. By night, Jeffrey returned to the Toys R Us store and continued living secretly behind the walls inside the building. According to investigative records, throughout this entire period, Jeffrey revealed very few signs that anything was unusual. That made tracking him far more difficult than many investigators had originally expected. But while Jeffrey worked to maintain his new life under the name John Zorn, strange signs inside the Toys R Us store began appearing more frequently. And that was the moment when Roofman's secret life slowly started moving toward discovery. In early 2005, the strange incidents inside the Toys R Us store in Charlotte began occurring more frequently. Employees repeatedly discovered that food was disappearing from the break room overnight. Some toys were found moved from their original locations, only to reappear in completely different sections of the store the next morning. According to accounts released years later, several employees working the morning shift also reported hearing unexplained noises coming from above the ceiling or from maintenance areas behind the store before opening hours. At first, most people dismissed the incidents as minor problems or harmless mischief occurring after closing time. But as the weeks passed, the situation became increasingly difficult to explain. The alarm system showed no clear signs of a break-in. Security cameras failed to capture anyone entering the store from outside. That led store managers to consider a far more unsettling possibility. Someone might actually be hiding inside the building. When police conducted a more thorough search of the area behind the store, they discovered a concealed living space built behind a wall near a stairwell. Inside, investigators found blankets, clothing, food, batteries, and numerous personal items used for everyday living. It didn't take long for investigators to realize that the person living inside that hidden room was very likely Jeffrey Manchester, the escaped prisoner wanted nationwide under the nickname Roofman. After months of effectively disappearing from the reach of American law enforcement, Jeffrey's secret life was finally beginning to unravel. After discovering Jeffrey Manchester's hidden living space inside the Toys R Us store, American law enforcement agencies intensified their efforts to track him down. According to investigative records released years later, authorities quickly determined that Jeffrey was still appearing around the Charlotte area under the alias John Zorn. Investigators soon shifted their attention toward the people who had interacted with him during his time on the run. One of the most important leads was Lee Wainscott, the woman Jeffrey had met while living under his new identity. According to investigative documents, Lee had absolutely no idea that the man she had come to know was actually an escaped prisoner wanted by law enforcement agencies across the United States. Investigators then began using Jeffrey's personal connections and social circle to track his movements and narrow down his whereabouts. As the net gradually tightened around him, Jeffrey found himself running out of options. Disappearing once again would be far more difficult than it had been before. In 2005, law enforcement agents finally located Jeffrey Manchester in Charlotte, North Carolina. The manhunt came to an end shortly afterward. After spending months secretly living inside a shopping center and maintaining a false identity, Roofman was finally captured and returned to the federal prison system. Jeffrey's second arrest quickly became a major story in the American media. It wasn't just because he was a dangerous escaped prisoner. It was because the way he had managed to disappear into everyday American society for months sounded more like the plot of a Hollywood movie than a real criminal case. But the reason Jeffrey Manchester's story continues to be discussed years later isn't simply because of the robberies or the daring prison escape. It's because of something far stranger. For months, he lived among thousands of people every single day, while almost no one realized he was there at all. After Jeffrey Manchester's case came to an end, many people viewed Roofman as nothing more than a robber with an unusually strange method of committing crimes. But for investigators and the American media, the reason this story remained famous years later had much less to do with the robberies themselves. Jeffrey rarely relied on sophisticated technology. He didn't hack banks. He didn't build a large criminal organization. And he didn't have the kind of professional support network often seen in some of America's most famous fugitive cases. Instead, most of what Jeffrey exploited came from understanding how people and systems functioned in everyday life. He understood how restaurants opened and closed each day, how employees reacted under pressure, how security systems focused on doors rather than rooftops, and how an ordinary-looking person could blend into society while attracting very little attention. According to investigative records released years later, Jeffrey's ability to adapt and remain calm was one of the key reasons he managed to avoid capture for so long. But what ultimately made the Roofman case one of the strangest criminal stories in modern American history happened after his prison escape. For months, Jeffrey Manchester secretly lived inside a crowded shopping center while almost nobody realized he was there. Every day, thousands of people walked past the Toys R Us store without knowing that an escaped federal prisoner was living behind the walls inside the building. That is one of the main reasons the story continues to appear in American documentaries, true crime television programs, and investigative specials years later. Because Jeffrey Manchester wasn't simply trying to outrun the police. For a time, he had found a way to almost completely disappear in plain sight within American society.